Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another terrifying tale. Today's story dives into the life of Mr. Souza, a man whose path was marked by a bizarre encounter he could have never anticipated. This story takes place in the city of Araquém, Brazil, back in 2015. At the time, Mr. Souza was 40 years old, and after leaving behind a life full of poor choices, he was trying to rebuild his life alongside his wife on a secluded farm in the countryside. However, what he experienced one early morning would forever change his perception of reality. Before we delve into the dark story, it's essential to understand Souza's past. In his youth, he lived in a rough neighborhood and got involved with the wrong people. Surrounded by those dealing in illegal trades, he admits that he was, indeed, a criminal at that time. But after years of distancing himself from that shadowy past, Souza lived a peaceful, reclusive life, seeking tranquility far from the city and its lingering memories. He believed his past was finally buried, until the day an old acquaintance, involved in the same criminal activities, knocked on his door, bringing with him a new wave of trouble. One ordinary night, this acquaintance unexpectedly showed up at the farm, desperate, asking for shelter and a place to hide from the police for a few days. He wanted to stay hidden in the barn, away from curious eyes and the justice system that pursued him. Mr. Souza hesitated, but memories of times when this man had helped him in the past weighed on his decision. With few options, he decided to take him in, giving him a few blankets and a corner in the barn to hide. However, he soon realized his old friend was not well. His body was covered in bandages and bore the signs of a violent, desperate escape. Once settled, the man began to recount what had happened. With a low, trembling voice, he revealed that he was being pursued not only by the police but by something far more terrifying, something that hunted him through the nights. The marks on his body were not only from his escape. Something had attacked him, something that didn't seem of this world. He described a creature in chilling detail, mentioning dark eyes that seemed to pierce the soul and sharp claws that had torn his flesh like paper. Mr. Souza listened in disbelief, trying to understand if this was just the product of despair or if something truly inexplicable was in play. Little did he know that, on that same night, the creature would also visit his farm, bringing with it a horror he would never be able to forget. The man began to tell his disturbing story, saying it had all started a few weeks before. In the early hours of one random morning, he decided to steal a motorcycle in the city, thinking it would be just another of his usual crimes, but it wasn't. Right after the theft, a police car started chasing him through the city streets. He tried to lose the officers by turning down a one-way street, speeding up like never before until he reached the road leading out of the urban area. However, even outside the city, the police stayed on his tail. Realizing he needed an unlikely escape route, he made a split-second decision to head into the woods on the motorcycle, disappearing among the trees and hiding in the darkness. The police drove past, unaware of where he was, and soon moved on, losing sight of him. Alone in the woods, he waited, heart racing, as he watched the police car return to the city a few minutes later. He thought the worst was over. 2 hours dragged by slowly, and, believing it was safe, he decided it was time to leave the woods. But as he prepared to go, he heard heavy, slow footsteps breaking twigs and dry leaves around him. Fear took hold of him, but he tried to stay calm, starting up the motorcycle and determined to get out of there as fast as possible. At that moment, something, a shadow that seemed to emerge from the depths of the vegetation, lunged at him. The creature attacked him violently, biting his shoulder with incredible force, knocking him to the ground. He barely had time to react before the being, huge and covered in thick, dark fur, began tearing at him with sharp teeth, biting him repeatedly. Desperation consumed him. Each bite was a stab of pure agony, and he felt life slipping away rapidly. In a desperate act, realizing his only chance was to fight, he managed to draw the gun he had at his waist. Trembling and full of adrenaline, he began firing repeatedly at the creature, each shot echoing through the woods like a scream for survival. After several shots, the beast finally let him go, retreating and emitting a growl of pain, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. Souza's friend, shaken and unsure what kind of animal had attacked him, knew he had to get out of there quickly because of the strange creature. Injured and fighting the throbbing pain in every part of his body, he dragged himself to the motorcycle, summoning strength he didn't know he still had. With a sudden move, he turned on the headlight, and that's when he saw the creature clearly. The beast was standing on 2 legs like a man, but its appearance was horrifying and surreal. It looked like a mix between a monkey and a pig, covered in thick black fur, much larger than any known animal. The most unsettling thing, however, was its eyes. They shone intensely, like two lit yellow lights, radiating a feeling of pure malice. Without hesitation, he revved the motorcycle and sped out of the forest, leaving that terrifying sight behind. Later, his voice still trembling with fear, he recounted the experience, convinced he might have encountered a werewolf or something even worse, as those glowing eyes would never leave his mind. The strangest thing of all happened to him after the attack. He reported that, a few days after that frightening encounter with the creature in the forest, he went through an even more terrifying episode. It was early morning, and he was walking the streets, trying to avoid curious looks. Suddenly, a sharp pain began spreading through his body, as if his bones were breaking from the inside. It was an unbearable pain, making his bones seem like they were cracking and his skin burning. He collapsed to the ground, thrashing violently in a seizure that overtook his entire body. The last thing he remembered was a man trying to help him, but then the man fled, terrified. The pain increased in Souza's friend's body until he blacked out, sinking into an absolute void that pulled him out of reality. When he finally regained consciousness, the sun was already rising. He woke up in a completely different place from where he had fainted. He was in the middle of the woods, far from the city and the spot where he had lost consciousness. Worse yet, he was naked, with no trace of his clothes, unable to understand how or why he had ended up there. His terror intensified when, trying to stand, he felt an overwhelming nausea. Within seconds, he was hunched over, vomiting frantically on the ground. But what he expelled wasn't ordinary. He was coughing up chicken feathers, many of them, as if something inside him was completely abnormal. He began to think he might have been cursed, hexed by some force beyond his understanding. It was as if something, or someone, had placed him in that surreal situation. With no logical explanation for what was happening, he felt trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Completely disoriented and terrified, he wondered how all of this was possible and what else might happen to him. That night, he made a drastic decision. He took some thick ropes with him and said he would tie himself up inside a stable on a farm. He was terrified of having another crisis, losing control, and ending up somewhere even stranger or, worse, hurting someone without even realizing it. He believed that these changes were not normal and that, somehow, they were linked to the attack by the creature he had encountered in the forest. He reported that his senses also seemed to be changing. His hearing and smell were sharper, as if he could hear and smell things at impossible distances. He felt disconnected from himself, especially at night, when his mind would simply shut off, and he had no idea what he might be doing while unconscious. Souza found the whole conversation extremely strange, but in the end, he left the man in the corral, tied up and secured with his own ropes. Souza returned to his house inside the ranch, and, frightened by the situation, he kept an eye on the barn, worried that the police might be tracking his friend. That night, hours passed, and something strange began to happen. Paulo's dogs started barking furiously near the corral, as if they saw something that completely unsettled them. Worried, Paulo grabbed a flashlight and went to check on what was happening, a heavy feeling washing over him. The idea of what that man might be capable of crossed his mind, and the worry that the man was in danger, or was the danger himself, made Souza quicken his pace. As he approached the corral, a chill ran down his spine. Something wasn't right, and the presence of his friend there, tied up, vulnerable, and afraid of his own body, made everything feel even darker and more surreal. With his heart racing, Paulo went to the corral to understand what was going on. As he got closer, he heard disturbing noises, like deep, menacing growls, as if some kind of wild animal was inside. He called out to his friend through the door, his voice filled with concern, but the only response was an even louder, more aggressive growl echoing through the night silence. Those sounds were unsettling, filled with a fury that didn't seem human. The dogs were frantic, trying to get inside the corral, barking as if they wanted to face whatever was in there. With a growing sense of fear, Souza peeked through a crack in the corral's wooden planks. The faint light revealed a shadow, a strange creature bound in the ropes his friend had brought along. At first, he was confused, trying to understand what he was seeing. It didn't make sense. Paulo quickly returned to the house, grabbed his shotgun, and went back to the corral, with the dogs even more agitated around him. When he opened the corral door and turned on the light, The sight that greeted him made him instantly recoil. There, trapped in the ropes, was a bizarre creature, an abomination he would never have imagined encountering. It was something between human and animal, a vision that froze his blood. The creature, upon seeing Souza and the dogs, began to snarl violently, displaying a visceral hatred. Souza felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at it. The being's appearance was grotesque. It looked like an ape, but with long, pointed ears like those of a dog, and a body resembling a man's, covered in dark, patchy fur, as if parts of its skin were burned or torn off. Its eyes were the most disturbing sight. They glowed with an almost supernatural intensity, as if fire pulsed within them, radiating a frightening yellow light. It was a demonic vision, a distortion between the human and the beastly, something that seemed to have crawled out of a nightmare. He immediately removed the dogs from the pen, locking them away to prevent them from attacking or being attacked by the creature. At that moment, he watched as the beast slowly rose onto two legs, balancing itself like a man. There was no longer any doubt. This was a werewolf, and as terrifying as it was to admit, he knew that the creature before him was none other than his friend. The man had transformed into that abomination, that hellish creature now roaring and struggling against the ropes that bound it. He stood still, in shock, trying to process what his eyes were seeing and what it all meant. His friend, the man he once knew, was now trapped in a monstrous body, a victim of a curse or something even worse that he couldn't comprehend. Faced with this surreal situation, even though he was armed and prepared to defend himself, Souza decided he didn't want to shoot the werewolf. After all, despite its bestial and menacing form, there was still a part of his friend trapped within that creature. He took a deep breath, tried to remain calm, and then chained the door of the pen with a heavy lock, ensuring the beast couldn't escape. He returned to his house, but fear kept him from resting. He spent the entire night with his eyes fixed on the pen, watching every movement, listening to every sound, ready to act at any moment. His rifle lay by his side, and his mind was on high alert. Souza knew that if the werewolf attempted to get out and came toward the house, he would have no choice but to shoot, even if it meant injuring or even killing his friend. The tension was unbearable, and every minute felt like an eternity as he awaited the worst. When the sun finally rose and daylight began to dispel the darkness, Souza decided it was time to face what had happened during the night. He went to the corral, still with his heart pounding, and unlocked the door carefully, feeling the cold morning air mingling with the fear that still haunted him. To his relief, his friend was inside, in human form, naked and visibly drained. He seemed disoriented, not fully aware of what had happened, but for Souza, the reality was clear. He knew his friend transformed into that creature at night. Wasting no time, he looked him in the eye and got straight to the point, asking him to gather his things and leave the property immediately. As painful as it was, Souza couldn't allow him to stay, not with his wife and young child living there. The presence of a werewolf, even if it was someone he'd known for years, was a risk he simply couldn't take. Stunned by Souza's reaction, his friend tried to argue, but Souza held firm. He said there was no place for him there anymore, and, realizing he had no other choice, his friend gathered his belongings and left without looking back. He disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. About a year after this unsettling event, Souza received word that his friend had been shot dead by a farmer in a nearby town. He didn't know exactly how it had happened. The accounts were confusing. Some said he died in human form while attempting to rob a farm. Others believed he was killed in his transformed state, as his body was found naked. To Souza, it was clear. His friend had somehow paid the price for what he had become, and his fate took a tragic, irreversible path. After everything he experienced, Souza reflected on how, coming from the big city and knowing nothing of these rural stories, he was utterly unprepared to handle something so bizarre. If he had known more about what a werewolf truly was, he might have acted differently from the moment his friend arrived seeking shelter, explaining he had been bitten by such a creature. Perhaps he would have been more cautious. Perhaps he could have avoided the fear and danger he went through. But the truth is, only when we come face to face with the unexplainable do we realize how vulnerable we really are. And that was his story with a werewolf, an experience Souza never imagined he'd live through. That was his true horror story with the werewolf. He hopes everyone enjoyed the tale, and if you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.